Okay, good morning, everyone. So, today's lecture, we're going to cover the safety of herbal medicine. And I think this is a good little topic because it kind of illustrates that for the most part, herbal medicine is very safe. But there are a few exceptions to this, and we have to consider those when we're recommending products or herbs to our patients. So, what we're going to talk about briefly is an overview of drug metabolism. Basically how drugs are absorbed and excreted. And this is a pretty simple cover of basic pharmacology stuff. And then we'll discuss phase 1 and phase 2 detox that you know a little bit about already. And then we'll go into what are the potential risks of taking herbs. So some of these we've already sort of discussed in the other lectures, and some of them we haven't. Finally, we'll talk about drug interactions and then safety concerns around pregnancy. Now, I don't know if you can read this on your slide or not at home, but basically, this is a list of the 10 most commonly used herbal products in the United States. I think it was done in 2008, so I'm sure it's changed by now. And if you look at this, the main ones are things like echinacea, ginseng, ginkgo, garlic, St. John's wort, peppermint, ginger, soy, chamomile, kava kava. And what's interesting is when you look at this, considering echinacea is one of the most common ones, commonly used products out there, whether it's effective or not, for a lot of these products, it's inconclusive. And sometimes they're likely effective or effective. But what I care about more is what's going on with the safety concerns. So I can accept that if a product like echinacea, if it's inconclusive whether it works or not, but it's safe, then I might be inclined to recommend it to a patient, mainly because you can't take antibiotic drugs for a cold or a flu, and that's what echinacea is often used for. So when you look at the side effects or safety concerns around echinacea, it basically says similar to placebo, so that's positive. With ginseng, limited data, but I could say there's thousands of people that have used ginseng and very few side effects, apart from maybe a little bit of increased hyperactivity or restlessness. And this can occur just because it may act as a bit of a stimulant in some people, but you know, a cup of coffee will do the same thing, so not a big deal. Ginkgo, no major issues, but there is some concerns with bleeding issues. It does act as a blood thinner. Garlic, maybe a little bit of odor, a little bit of heartburn. It could cause some increased bleeding. St. John's wort, pretty safe, but maybe some drug interactions, or there are definitely some drug interactions that can occur. Peppermint, limited side effects, mostly mild. Ginger, no known side effects. Soy, concerns regarding long-term estrogenic effects, although a recent publication showed that there's no increased risk of breast cancer, and it doesn't even appear to interact with tamoxifen, one of the drugs used for breast cancer, so that's positive. Chamomile, very rare allergic reactions can occur with it. And then kava kava, there are case reports of liver toxicity with it, although we can discuss that more later on. But so, based on the best available evidence, most of the commonly used herbs out there are pretty safe. They don't have a lot of side effects, which is positive. Some of these products work, or it's inconclusive, and so I don't really see a lot of harm in doing it. At the very worst case scenario for most of these, well, I'd say worst case scenario, they could interact with some of the drugs that people are taking. That would be the worst case scenario. Second is they don't work. And I haven't really had a lot of people complain of side effects for most of the products that I've recommended in the last 13 years. So I'm not overly concerned with the safety of herbs. But it's worth understanding a few things because there are some serious interactions that we should be concerned about. Now, drug metabolism, basically the way that drugs get into your body is you take them in internally. You can also apply them externally as well, and some of them will diffuse through your skin, but for the most part, you take a pill, you put it in your mouth. It may be affected by the stomach acid, and sometimes stomach acid with certain drugs like alkaloids, it can increase or decrease the absorption rate of those drugs. Most drugs will then, some might be absorbed in the stomach, some might pass through the small intestines and be absorbed into circulation there. They may be processed by the liver and become transformed, and then they can be excreted and basically the bile through the feces or out through the urine. Some drugs may also be excreted through just from exhaling, like through the air, also through the skin. And what can also happen is, as drugs are being excreted through the feces, they can be acted on by gut bacteria that can deconjugate these and change the transformed drugs so that they can be reabsorbed again. So that's kind of a quick little summary of what happens with drugs. There's lots of different processes that take place in the body that can alter the effects of the drugs, make them inactive, make them more water soluble. It's pretty complex. So what basically happens is when you take a drug orally, basically there may be no drug levels in your blood for the first little bit, and then as it becomes absorbed, you'll get a peak over a period of time, and the kidneys and the bowels start to excrete the drug. Over a period of time, the levels in the blood will start to drop. And this sort of the time it takes to get rid of the drugs is often, it depends on the type of drug that usually they'll refer to as the half-life of the drug in the body. And so how many hours or how many minutes does it last in the body before half of the drug has been excreted. And for the most part, this is usually hours, but some drugs it could even be days or it could be days. Some drugs, it may be even minutes, depending on how quickly the body acts on it. So something like taking a shot of it, like an EpiPen, that'll only last for a few minutes in the body. Maybe the half-life is a few minutes, while a drug like Detox could be hours, maybe even possibly days that it can last in the body. So when it comes to the absorption of drugs, there's a few different things that we want to look at. So that they can be absorbed in the mouth, the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, skin. You can also inhale drugs as well. And there are various things that can decrease the rate of absorption of drugs. So one of the ways that herbal products can affect drugs is it can decrease the absorption of them. And it can either do that by binding up the drugs or by forming like a gelatinous barrier that can slow down the absorption of them. So when you're looking at things like fiber or anything that's rich in fiber, like mucilage, gums, and gels, what happens is the drugs, when they're in that matrix, they can get trapped in there, or it can slow down the absorption so that it could affect the rate at which the drugs are absorbed, and it could also affect the amount of the drug that gets absorbed. And so as a result, what can happen is it may make the drug less effective or delay the response of the drug. So here is something like some type of fiber like Metamucil that's made from psyllium husk. Also slippery elm would do this, marshmallow would do this, even eating a lot of ground up flax and chia. What would happen is when it reacts with water, when it dissolves in water, it'll form like a matrix of jello, like a jello-like consistency. And you can appreciate that if you were in your swimming pool and you replaced it with jello and you tried to swim through it, you would find that you'd be moving much slower. And that's what will happen, whether it's the drug that's sort of trapped in the lumen of the bowel and all the and trapped in that gel that the fiber makes, or if it's even sugar will be affected that way. And so this will basically slow down the rate at which it's absorbed and also decrease the peak. So the amplitude may be decreased and it may make a broader curve. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. This might actually prolong the effects of the drug, but maybe make it less intense. In the case of sugar, it has a positive effect where if you have a lot of fiber with a sugary meal, it basically decreases the insulin spike and helps to give you a more of a slow release of energy as the sugar moves into the blood. So it's not all bad, but potentially what it can do is delay the drugs and decrease the intensity, and that's what those arrows are showing there. It's not unlike if you drink alcohol on an empty stomach. Food, if you take it with food, it's going to slow down the rate at which the alcohol gets into the body, and you won't feel quite as intoxicated if you're eating it or drinking with food versus on an empty stomach. Now, another thing that can happen is you can decrease the absorption of drugs by combining drugs with, not all drugs, but certain drugs with tannins. And so what tannins may do to certain drugs is they combine them up, because these phenolic compounds are relatively reactive, and they may interact with minerals or with alkaloids. So if you're taking an iron supplement, or you're taking certain drugs that may be nitrogen based, and other types of drugs may also interact with them, it'll form some kind of complex that basically inhibits the absorption and doesn't really allow them to enter into the bloodstream. They'll just stay in the lumen of the bowel. So that's one way they can affect it. The other way is if you consume high amounts of tannins, what it can do is alter the mucous membranes and basically make them thicker so that they're less permeable, and this can also decrease the absorption of drugs. So the main types of compounds are going to be phenolic compounds, and most of these are going to be the tannins, and these can be either the hydrolyzable tannins, like what you'll find in witch hazel and oak, and this is basically glycosides of gallic acid, or it could be the non-hydrolyzable tannins, the proanthocyanidins, that basically can have an astringent effect. And this is going to be related to the blue and the red colors that you're going to see in certain types of berries, bilberry, blueberry, even red wine has some proanthocyanidins in it. Now, something else to be aware of is when it comes to iron absorption, many women have troubles getting adequate amount of iron, and it's due to many different factors. It can the acidity of the stomach. If it's too low, it doesn't allow for proper ionization of the iron, so it can be absorbed. If the woman, maybe they've got a little bit of irritation in the bowels, and the transit times, the bowels basically are moving too quickly, maybe you're not getting as much absorption that way. If there are a few things that have been shown to help with iron absorption is taking something like probiotics, which can help to digest the food and release certain complexes that can form with iron. So those are all sort of positive things that you can sort of work with to improve iron absorption. Also, what I would probably recommend a lot of patients, if they're taking iron, to avoid taking it around, I would say, fruits and vegetables and herbal products in general have the potential to interact with iron. Now, if someone likes taking peppermint or chamomile tea, even green tea or black tea, chocolate, all those things have the potential to bind up iron and decrease the bile. It doesn't mean that you can't take peppermint tea or eat chocolate when you're on an iron supplement. It just means that you want to separate it, and you don't want to basically take a piece of chocolate and drink some herbal tea at the exact same time you take your iron supplement. Maybe spread it out by an hour, and at least then the iron has an opportunity to kind of get a head start on these phenolic compounds that are responsible for chelating some of these metals. So if you were to take some type of tannin like tea, and I would imagine black tea is probably going to be much worse than even adding a little bit of milk to the tea, just because the milk will bind up the tannins and make them less reactive. But if you're taking even herbal teas with iron or certain types of drugs, not all drugs, then you may just find that because it binds it up, it'll just decrease the amount that's available and just decrease the desired levels. Now, just as an aside, what's interesting is that vitamin to help with iron absorption. So orange juice appears to help with the absorption of a certain type of iron supplement called ferrous fumarate. There are different types of iron supplements available on the market, But in general, because of the vitamin C in orange juice, even though it has some phenolic compounds in it, overall the vitamin C and whatever is in the orange juice appears to have a beneficial effect on increasing the absorption of iron. However, when you look at apple juice, which also has vitamin C, it doesn't seem to help. So I don't know precisely what's going on. Maybe there's other compounds involved with orange juice that can help with that as well. So just an interesting little study on that. Now, when it comes to once the drugs are in your body, how do you get rid of them? And there's a few different ways that your body does this. I've mentioned this before, and I'm going to mention it now during these slides, is that when you take a drug, typically the most basic sort of drug metabolism that takes place in the body is that you get a drug that undergoes phase 1 detoxification, and this involves the enzymes like the P450s, and these are the cytochrome enzymes that basically perform oxidation and reduction reactions. And in some cases, what will happen is the drug becomes reactive, some kind of reactive intermediate, and then during phase 2 conjugation, what ends up happening is some type of cofactor is added to the intermediate compound, and this will now make some type of conjugated drug that now becomes more water soluble, so it can be excreted in the feces or the urine. And so Tylenol is a classic one that undergoes this, where Tylenol undergoes phase 1. It has a reactive intermediate, which is actually very toxic, and then cysteine is attached onto it during phase 2 conjugation, making it safe and eliminating it. In some cases, the phase 1 detoxification process will actually make a reactive intermediate that can be hepatotoxic. And so you'll see this, as I mentioned, with Tylenol, and I think also with certain herbal products like the phenylpropenes, they potentially can cause damage to the liver, and I think it's through the same sort of mechanism. And there are other drugs, so things like saffron, which was the essential oil that was in root beer, it causes liver issues if you take it in high amounts, and that's why it was banned by the FDA as a food additive. So I just described this process here. The main purpose of phase 1 detoxification is to alter the drug to make it more reactive or to make it more water soluble, so that you can be basically excreted or stuck onto another phase 2 conjugate. Now, in general, my advice is I don't generally like to give substances that stimulate phase 1 detox by itself. And so my concern with doing that is that if you upregulate phase 1 detox without having adequate phase 2 detoxification, what can end up happening is you generate more reactive intermediates. And so there's evidence that shows things like grapefruit juice, which slows down phase 1 detoxification, can actually have a protective effect against, let's say, people who smoke or eat a lot of barbecue food, because in those cases, that char or those byproducts of smoking, they become even more toxic when they go into the liver and become activated by the P450s, called the CYP enzymes, and there are CYP isozymes. And as a result, by drinking grapefruit juice, if you're a smoker, can actually decrease the production of these reactive intermediates and lower the risk of getting lung cancer. Now, the best way to lower lung cancer is don't smoke, but these are little factors that could contribute to that. So when it comes to phase 1 detoxification, just to be aware, there are dozens of different P450 enzymes, and so one drug may be metabolized by one, like a P450 called CYP3A1, and then you could have another drug that's metabolized by a CYP1C something or another. So we're still learning about all this. So just because a particular herbal product affects one of the isozymes, the P450s like the CYP3A1, doesn't mean that it will affect drugs metabolized by other isozymes. So you have to kind of understand which groups of drugs are affected by which enzymes and whether or not the herbal product will affect that. So there are some phase 1 detox inhibitors that we'll talk about. The classic one is going to be grapefruit juice. And so grapefruit juice contains a furanocoumarin called bergamottin. And this compound here is what basically inhibits the phase 1 detox. And so this is, I don't know if it's good or bad. It sort of depends on how you're looking at it. Where this can be problematic is if somebody is on certain medications like statin drugs that are used to lower cholesterol and can have significant side effects, including muscle pain, and they can even result in death if you take a high enough dose of statins. When you combine a statin drug with grapefruit juice, what will happen is it will basically, think about it, if it's inhibiting phase 1 detox, what does that mean? What happens to the drug levels of that? Just think about it for a second. Does it elevate or does it decrease? So if you take grapefruit juice with a drug like a statin, it elevates the amount of statin in the body. And that now means that you're increasing the risk of having like a toxic overload and increasing potential side effects. So here we got some grapefruit juice. You take it with your statin drug. So because it's affecting the detoxification processes, it means that the drugs aren't being cleared from the system as quickly, and as a result, you're going to see elevated drug levels. And so in some cases, this could get you above the desired levels and get into the toxic levels, okay? So grapefruit juice is just one example. There are other herbs that contain furanocoumarins in it, and not all these herbs have been studied for the effects that they could have on statin drugs or other drugs that are affected by these phase 1 enzymes. So generally speaking, if I know someone's on a statin drug, I may be reluctant to give them a herb that contains a furanocoumarin in it. And there's a number of herbs that are in the Apiaceae family. I think I would want to look at some of the plants like Angelica, Arch Angelica potentially has some of these guys in it. There's other ones like prickly ash has it. Some of the members of the grapefruit family also has it, like ruta. So these guys I would just be cautious of recommending, and I'd have to sort of double check if I in a book to see what constituents they have in it. So this is one of the reasons why understanding what phytochemicals are in plants, it gives you the ability to sort of make an educated guess whether there's going to be potential problems or not. So the take-home message is furanocoumarins inhibit phase 1, and now there's other drugs that induce phase 1. And so what happens if you induce phase 1? It basically means that you upregulate the enzymes, or you stimulate these enzymes to work more effectively, or there's just more of these enzymes in the liver doing their job. And so St. John's wort is the classic herb, and it's the only one that I know of that induces phase 1 detoxification pathways. And so what would happen if you took St. John's wort with certain drugs is it would basically clear them from the body faster. So as a result, you may end up getting lower levels of the desired drug. And so it could potentially make the drugs less effective. So St. John's, so contrast that to grapefruit juice. Grapefruit juice will elevate the drugs. It could actually make the drugs more effective, but it could also make them more toxic. St. John's wort is likely to make the drugs less effective. It probably won't make the drugs, a lot of drugs, less more dangerous, with the exception if you combine it with antidepressant drugs. But this could still be problematic. Now, in the case of, for example, HIV patients, if they're taking antiviral drugs that are required to be at a certain level in the blood to be effective, and you start combining it with St. John's wort, the concern is that you could actually decrease the amount of the drug in the system, and that could allow the viral load of the HIV patient to rise because there's not enough, basically, antiviral drugs to keep them in check. So combining St. John's wort with antiviral drugs would be problematic. Another issue that I could see is there may be a concern with women who are taking the birth control pill combining it with St. John's wort, because we know that St. John wort affects some of the enzymes that metabolize estrogens in the body. So I don't know precisely what happens. I don't know if there's any case reports or not, but the concern would be if you took a bunch of St. John's wort, it could decrease the effects of the birth control pill, and that might allow you to ovulate, and then it could increase the risk of pregnancy. So, and for some women, that would be an undesirable side effect. So those are a few things to think about. So to summarize, grapefruit juice elevates, St. John's wort decreases drug levels, and I want you to know that. Now with phase 2 detoxification, in general, I don't think there's much harm in supporting phase 2 detoxification. It doesn't seem to negatively impact the drugs as much as phase 1, messing around with phase 1 can. And in general, I'd say improving phase 2 detoxification in general seems to help to decrease some of the side effects and also has a protective effect against cancer. When you induce phase 1, it can increase the risk of cancer. When you induce phase 2, it usually decreases cancer and some of the toxic effects of things. And so what ends up happening here is once the drugs have been metabolized by phase 1, you want to stick a substance onto it that'll basically neutralize it and make it easier to excrete. And so the drug, once it undergoes phase 2 detoxification, is typically more water soluble and also is safer. Now there are different chemicals or compounds that can be cofactors that can be stuck onto a drug, and a few of these are sulfur-based compounds like glutathione or cysteine. These are two types of reactions that can that are often used for things like Tylenol. You could also use acetylation, so using a certain vitamin, vitamin B5, I believe it is involved with acetylation. You can also use glucuronidation, where you basically take a sugar called glucuronic acid and you stick it onto a drug or a hormone. This happens sometimes with the phenolic compounds. They'll use glucuronidation, so it can also happen with be used with estrogens. Methylation typically uses S-adenosylmethionine, which is related to B12 and folic acid. It's a methylating agent that can be used to inactivate certain things. Neurotransmitters, for example, are typically used, SAMe, with an enzyme called catechol-methyltransferase. It's another enzyme in the body that's used to inhibit certain neurotransmitters, but this can also occur with drugs. And then finally, another amino acid is glycine. It can often be attached on as certain drugs for excretion. So basically the take-home message here is that depending on the drug, there will be different substrates and different cofactors that will be used to excrete them from the body. Some of them are amino acids, some of them are sugars, some of them are methylating agents, some of them are sulfation steps. Now, just in general, a few little ideas of things that could affect liver metabolism. We know that things like dandelion and turmeric are often referred to as liver herbs, and dandelion has been used traditionally for skin conditions to help promote digestion, to help with it's a very gentle detox. And what's interesting is that we know from looking at some studies that constituents in dandelion appear to upregulate enzymes that are involved with glucuronidation. And so the enzyme called UDP glucuronal transferase is one of the enzymes that takes glucuronic acid, a sugar, and then sticks it onto various substrates. And this could be something like estrogen. And what's interesting about that is often in herbal medicine, liver herbs and things like dandelion are often used to help women with hormonal problems, because I guess when you stimulate the liver, it helps to improve the excretion of hormones, and that can help to balance it. Indirectly, they improve digestion, which is positive, and they can also work on the bowels. And so that may be one of the mechanisms that dandelion could have a beneficial effect on balancing female hormones. Turmeric also does this, and turmeric's another great herb that, in addition to having anti-inflammatory effects, hepatoprotective effects, anti-cancer effects, it appears to help upregulate this enzyme involved with glucuronidation. So it could help with female hormones. It could also help have an anti-cancer effect through this process as well. Now, when it comes to phase detox, the other important process is sulfation. And I think in general, eating foods that contain sulfur groups appear to have some positive effect on upregulating the production of glutathione. And glutathione it's a small, really small peptide. Basically has 3 amino acids, which includes cysteine. And it's one of the stable sulfur compounds in the body that's very important as a mucolytic to help with respiratory issues. It's found in the lungs. It's also used in detoxification and chelation of heavy metals. And so there are a number of different sulfur-containing plants, like members of the brassica family that contains sulforaphane. This is an important thing that you'll get in high amounts in broccoli sprouts, but you'll get in other members of the broccoli family as well. Also, I would imagine garlic, I suspect onions as well, which contain sulfur compounds, likely upregulate this this enzyme called glutathione S transferase, and so it's going to help to increase the amount of glutathione. And glutathione does contain a sulfur group, so maybe that's what the mechanism is there. Turmeric also upregulates this enzyme and may help with glutathione conjugation, but it doesn't appear, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think turmeric has sulfur-containing compounds in the herb, so, or not significant amount. So it must be doing it by a different mechanism. So the purpose of this is I just want to illustrate a couple herbs that we know that can have a positive effect on phase 2 detoxification. So turmeric, that's a good thing for your liver. Eating some garlic, eating your broccoli has lots of benefits, including may help support liver detoxification, helps with the excretion of certain hormones potentially. And we mentioned dandelion, but I'm sure there's lots of other herbs that have a positive effect on these enzymes as well. Now, one of the problems that can happen is if you upregulate phase 1 detoxification, but you have inadequate amount of the conjugates present to help during phase 2 conjugation, what can happen is you'll see an increase in the levels of the reactive intermediates. In the case of Tylenol, it can become extremely toxic and will destroy the liver. And I'm not sure if I mentioned it before, but Tylenol is the #1 cause of liver transplants in North America. And it basically is because people are taking too high a dose, or they're getting inadequate amounts of cysteine. And so cysteine can be purchased as a supplement called NAC, N-acetylcysteine. And it's basically, if you look at the CPS, which is one of the drug pharmacology books, cysteine is the antidote to Tylenol poisoning. So someone overdoses on Tylenol, you give them the amino acid cysteine, which is a natural product, and you can save their life. So, and just as an aside, vegan-based diets are going to be much lower in cysteine, so that vegans could be more susceptible to Tylenol poisoning. And also the elderly, which tends to have lower amounts of protein in their diet, are probably going to be more susceptible to Tylenol overdose as well. So keep your eye on that. The take-home message here is you got to make sure that you support phase 2 conjugation and don't overstimulate phase 1 detoxification. So here's all the different phase 2 conjugates that can be involved in the liver. I'm sure there's more, but this is sort of the basic summary of it. Each of these could probably be, every single one of these can be purchased as a natural supplement as well, natural health product. So those are just a few references you can look at. Now another, the classic herb for the liver is milk thistle. And so we know that it's used historically to support liver function, helps protect the liver. It's considered hepatoprotective. It appears to support phase 2 detoxification. Does not appear to stimulate phase 1 detoxification, and rather it actually inhibits it a little bit, slows down phase 1 detoxification. So you're going to have less reactive intermediates there, which is positive. So when you slow down phase 1 and increase phase 2, and make sure that you have less reactive intermediates in the body. Now, there could be implications on elevating drug levels to a dangerous level. But I remember seeing a few studies that the college did with milk thistle and antiretroviral drugs, and there didn't seem to be any sort of negative impact by combining them with milk thistle. So you'd want to look at sort of the individual drugs. Certainly with a statin drug, I haven't actually checked. It may be positive or it may be a negative effect it would have on that. I don't know. I haven't looked at that. So the main effects that we know that milk thistle has on the body is it helps with liver regeneration. So animal studies show when they take out a piece of an animal's liver, the liver is one of the few organs that can actually regenerate, and by taking milk thistle, it seems to help with this process. The flavonolignin that's in there, like a lot of flavonoids and lignans, has potent antioxidant effects. Specifically, silibin, which is one of the flavonolignans in milk thistle, appears to increase glutathione production, which is good. And so in general, that's going to help decrease reactive intermediates for the most part, and also provide good antioxidant support in the liver. So if you do have more reactive intermediates, it can help sequester the free radicals that they may generate. They also kind of interact with the hepatocytes and help to basically occupy the cells and prevent the binding of other toxins to them. So it can have a protective effect against some sort of toxic compounds that can occur. And the final thing that I think is kind of interesting is that these constituents may inhibit beta-glucuronidase. Now that enzyme is not in the liver, but rather that's an enzyme that's expressed by certain gut bacteria. And so what happens is if you were to take, let's say if your estrogens in your body were being processed by the liver, it tends to use glucuronidation as one of the phase 2 processes. You stick on glucuronic acid, you've now made estrogen more water soluble, because as you know, estrogen is a fat soluble compound, it's a steroid, and it tends to diffuse through cell membrane. So it can kind of go anywhere in the body it wants just by diffusing through things, and it's not very water soluble. And so when you add a glucuronic acid, as we mentioned before, it's a type of sugar that then becomes like an estrogen glycoside. It will travel through the bowels and the feces, and eventually will get excreted. But one of the problems is if the bowels are kind of slow, that means that these estrogen conjugates are hanging around there longer, and if you have certain gut bacteria that possess the beta-glucuronidase enzyme, what will end up happening is that these gut bacteria will cleave off the glucuronic acid and use it as a fuel source, then liberating the estrogens that then can be reabsorbed and basically migrate across the lumen of the bowel and get back into the circulation, and can cause women to have elevated estrogen levels. And so as a result, when you see certain women have severe kind of picture of estrogen excess in their body, where they could have really severe menstrual cramps and maybe they're having skin issues as well, that would be something where I'd want to evaluate how well are the bowels having more than one bowel movement a day, or are they even having a bowel movement a day? Because if the bowels are slowed down too much, that means that there's going to be more time for the gut flora to cleave off these glucuronic acid sugars. And the other thing I want to look at is, you know, are they getting adequate amount of the glucuronic acid in general? And you might want to consider giving them herbs like milk thistle to help sort of inhibit that that beta-glucuronidase enzyme and maybe better support glucuronidation in the liver. So that's milk thistle for you and how it can help interact with the liver. Now, in general, when you're looking at safety studies, there's a few different ways we can evaluate the safety of herbs. The first study that typically when you do a drug study, what ends up happening is they'll take the drug and put it into cells in a test tube just to see if there's any kind of interaction. And that would be one way that we'd look at stuff. The benefit of doing that is you're not really causing any harm to humans, and you can isolate that precise mechanism or effect that you're looking for. So this would be, you take the enzyme like the P450 CYP3A form, and you combine it with a herb to see whether or not that enzyme gets inhibited by that herbal extract. So you could then look at, without giving it to humans, which can be one, some ethical concerns, and two, expensive, you could test thousands of different interactions in a day and see if there's any problems. And that would then give you a little bit of information where you might then proceed with doing a study with humans. Now, the disadvantage of doing this is you can't necessarily extrapolate these results to humans. Certainly, if I knew that an in vitro study showed that a particular herb that I like inhibits an enzyme in the liver, I would then use it with caution with people who have that. It doesn't mean that it will or will not interact in a patient that's taking the herb at a particular dose, but it kind of raises a red flag. The other thing that it doesn't really look at is what happens with when you take a particular natural supplement or you take that drug into the body, and it doesn't really look at the pharmacokinetics. So we know that anytime you put anything in your body, it's going to be metabolized. It could be protonated in the stomach. It could be transformed in the liver, conjugated. There's all sorts of different things that can happen in the body. So it may not necessarily, the effects that occur in a test tube is going to be very different than what's going to occur in the body, because there's so many other factors taking place. And not only is that drug affected by the body, but other things floating around in the body, whether that's hormones or other drugs or certain enzymes, could certainly have a major impact on it, making it difficult to predict what's going to happen. The third thing of the disadvantage when you're looking at safety studies is when you have a test tube, somebody might take a test tube and put cells in it and then add, let's say, something like berberine, the isoquinoline alkaloid that acts as an antimicrobial, and put it into the cell, the test tube with the cells. And what might end up happening is the berberine could end up causing cancer of those cells. And then you'd say, well, we shouldn't recommend berberine to patients because it has a cancer, a carcinogenic effect. The problem is that may be true, but we don't know whether or not, if you're putting 1 gram of berberine, pure berberine, into a test tube that only has 10 mils of water, the concentration of the berberine far exceeds what you're ever going to have in your body. So it may be that, yes, it does cause cancer, but you'd have to eat a pound of golden seal or 2 pounds of golden seal to reach that level to have it and take it long term for it to have a carcinogenic effect. So a few different things that you have to consider. I think it's worth doing studies in animals and in test tubes. And again, one of the other challenges is when you look at, if I were to give a drug to a rat, they have a different liver and they have a different way of metabolizing things. So good or bad things that occur in a rat study or a mouse study may not be extrapolated into humans. It just gives you some more ideas of, like, an educated guess of what might happen, but it's not definitive, that's for sure. So that's basically in vitro and in vivo. So in vitro, in case you don't know, that means vitro means glass in Latin, and vivo means life. So one's in a glass and the other one's in a living organism. And that's what those two types of studies are. And actually, you might just want to add this in there. There we go. And make sure I'm not cutting you off. Sorry about that. The next thing when we're looking at safety studies is it's worth having a look at case reports. So some of the advantage of case reports is basically if you have a patient that you give a particular herb to, like, let's say kava or milk thistle or whatever it may be, and they suddenly have an adverse reaction, then what you can do is publish a case report. And you can submit this to Health Canada, and they'll keep a record of what's going on. And one of the benefits of it is if you get a whole bunch of clinicians that don't normally communicate with each other at the field, and they start writing case reports saying, I gave this to someone, they may have had a liver issue. If you start seeing 5 or 10 or 20 of these things start to surface, then you may be seeing a pattern with a particular herb or a particular batch of a herb. It may not be that, let's say, kava kava is causing, or it may not be that all kava products are causing this problem. It could just be that there's a certain company that's made it from maybe an adulterated product that is causing liver problems. And so publishing liver case reports is important. One of the disadvantages of case reports is you tend to get a publication bias. So what I find is that naturopaths are reluctant to publish anything saying a herb is bad because they're afraid Health Canada is going to put a warning or a ban on this product unfairly. So naturopaths are less likely to write a case report because Health Canada may overreact. And then when you look at medical doctors, they tend to have a little bit of a bias against natural products. They don't know a lot about it, so they're more likely to, if anything goes wrong with their patients and they're taking a natural health product, they may blame it on the natural product when it's could be a drug that they prescribe instead or whatever. So there's a bias and an opinion that goes along with the case report. So it's not really good science. It's just sort of an observation, and that's very biased and open to interpretation. But I still feel they are worthwhile reporting these things. The final type of safety studies you can perform are clinical trials. Now, the great thing about clinical trials is you give a drug or a herb to a bunch of people, and then you compare it to a bunch of people that didn't get the herb. And if you notice that a number of the people getting the herb had, let's say, heartburn or diarrhea or a skin reaction, then, and you don't see that in the control group, then you know there are side effects associated with that herb. So it's good because it basically helps you remove compounding variables that you might see, like with a case report. You've got one person who's taking something, and he could be on other drugs. He could be eating a bad diet. He may have just gotten back from a trip from India and got exposed to something over there. So clinical trials removes those compounding variables, and it also uses more people. So you're not just looking at one person. You're looking at hopefully hundreds of people, and so it decreases sort of the confusion that can occur. The biggest issue with clinical trials is you're not going to do necessarily a safety trial where you give a whole bunch of humans a plant that could be toxic at a certain level to see what happens, because that's not ethical. I'm sure humans have done those studies in the past, like in Nazi Germany, things like that, but we're not doing those anymore. So, or hopefully we're not, although, anyways, sometimes drug companies will test these things in other foreign countries where things are a little less strict, but anyways, that's another story. So the disadvantages mostly that we'll see is that doing a proper clinical trial costs a lot of money and takes time. And so if you want to do a big clinical trial, I would say you're looking at minimum $100,000 to conduct one. And for me, if I'm not going to make my money back, I'm not going to just, because I'm curious, invest $100,000 to evaluate the safety and efficacy of dandelion leaves, because I'll never make my money back. So that's just a business decision. So difficult sometimes to get a lot of research, and that's why there's much more research being done on drugs than there are on natural products. It all comes down to funding. So those are a few little examples of different types of safety studies that you can conduct with plants. What was interesting, I'm going to have to, I don't think when I migrated this all came in. No, it didn't come in properly. So I'm going to show you this. What's interesting is this is a case report that was published in a Canadian journal, Family Physicians, And basically what happened was they are saying that patients with a certain type of hemochromatosis, which is an iron overload in the body, should be cautious about taking milk thistle, because they had a patient who seemed to have gotten worse from taking a milk thistle product. Now, what's interesting, if you go and read the case report, this person, they had a terrible diet, they're on a whole bunch of drugs, they had a lot of things going on that may have been contributing to the liver problem that they're experiencing. Hemochromatosis increases the risk of having a liver issue because of all the excess iron becomes toxic. But then if you're on a lot of drugs, that could have a negative effect as well. And in this publication, the authors didn't bother to go into detail in the abstract here to say not only were they taking milk thistle, but they were drinking and they were taking Tylenol and they're doing all these other bad things. And so it appears that this would be an example of a publication bias, where I really don't think it's fair that if they were my patient, I wouldn't have jumped to conclusions and gone to the milk thistle. It just didn't seem like to be the most likely thing. I'd be more likely to say maybe low-dose Tylenol is toxic in people who have hemochromatosis, and we should evaluate whether we should give them or not. This just depends on the perspective. And what's interesting, if you look at milk thistle, they're saying that it could increase the absorption of iron and have a negative effect. But what I find kind of neat, or not neat, but curious, is that in another journal article, which was published a couple years later, that they basically found that milk thistle may actually reduce iron absorption and could have a positive effect in people with hemochromatosis. So, and these guys are actually recommending that it should be given as an adjunctive treatment for hemochromatosis. So this was done with more people. This is done with a single patient. So you can see that a case report can give very misleading information because of that bias. That's why I'm showing you that one. And I thought that was just one particular interesting study. And I don't know if I have, yeah, unfortunately, I don't know why it's not loading properly. So a few things that we want to look at are adverse reactions to therapeutic index. Now, the therapeutic index or ratio is basically, it's kind of like your risk-benefit analysis. It gives you what is the ratio of the effective dose versus the lethal dose. So how much of the drug or plant do you have to take to have a therapeutic effect compared to how much will cause a toxic effect? And so what that means is, for example, at the therapeutic dose is here, and the lethal dose is here, that would be pretty close. For example, something like chamomile tea, the therapeutic dose may be way over here, the toxic dose is way over here. So that's very safe because it has a very broad therapeutic index, because the dose that's safe or that's effective is extremely far away. Maybe like you have to drink 1,000 gallons of chamomile before you cause death. So it's a very, very safe herb. Now, there may be other ones where you could have the therapeutic dose is very small, in the case of, let's say, aconite, digitalis, belladonna, and the amount that is toxic, it may be very close, or it may even overlap with the therapeutic dose. And so as a result, that would have a narrow therapeutic index. And so the way that they study this with drugs is they'll take, there are things called the LD50 or TD50. LD50 typically refers to the amount of a substance required to kill 50% of the population. So what you'll do is you'll take 100 rats and you'll give them, let's say, 30 grams of drug. And if you don't kill half the population yet, then you'll increase to 100 grams, and then eventually be like, okay, so 100 grams is the lethal dose to kill, let's say, 100 kilograms of rat. And this exists, and this is what drug companies typically do, and that's some of the ethical concerns with that. You can't do this with humans, obviously. So that's what the LD50 is, and they usually look at that. and then they look at what's the dosage, how many grams is required to have that therapeutic or that effective dose. There's also not just the LD50, there could be the toxic dose. So maybe you're not killing everything, but maybe you're getting to a level where it's causing some other symptoms of toxicity, and that would be the same thing. So the main benefit of understanding if something has a broad or a narrow therapeutic index is a broad therapeutic index, like chamomile, means it's safe. Narrow therapeutic means it's riskier. And I would say most herbs have a relatively broad therapeutic index, but there are certain herbs that have a, maybe a more narrower one, like ephedra, you got to be a little bit careful with. And then I've never used aconite or belladonna in practice, but those would be examples of two herbs that would have a very narrow therapeutic index. So these are things that you might want to consider. Now, there are various types of risks associated with giving a plant, and I want to emphasize that you can cause harm not just by giving something that's toxic, but you can give harm by giving an ineffective treatment where you have a serious disease where something effective exists. An example of this might be, let's say, with the case of that family in Alberta that decided not to take their child to the hospital who had meningitis, and they treated it with echinacea or whatever herbal supplements, and the child died. And under these circumstances, the issue is that that child could have gotten much more effective treatments at a hospital than they would have going to a naturopath or going and taking some sort of herbal tincture. And so the herbal tincture like echinacea is going to be relatively ineffective or not effective enough to treat meningitis. And so by not giving that child effective treatment, you can cause death. And this is one of the big issues, is that it's our responsibility as naturopaths when we see somebody who's coming in who's very sick and there may be an effective treatment that conventional medicine has, you better refer. Even if the herbal stuff works, which I'm not saying it does or it doesn't, even if the herbal stuff works under these circumstances, if anything bad happens, you'll get blamed for it in your own practice. Now, just as an aside, the naturopath that was being accused of or who may have been involved in this, there any wrongdoings associated with the case because they never actually saw the patient. The parents basically just picked up something from their clinic and went home, but they didn't know it was for a kid with meningitis. And the naturopath even said that they should take the kid to the hospital on a different day. So anyway, so another example is of how you can cause harm by giving the wrong treatment or an ineffective treatment is, let's say somebody has you choose not to vaccinate your kids because you're concerned that vaccinations could cause harm to the child. And there are risks associated with vaccinating children. And in this case, if you don't vaccinate and your child ends up getting tetanus or something, they could die because they didn't get vaccinated. So there are risks associated with not getting vaccinated or taking a drug. Another example would be there was at least 2 or 3 case reports of people in Europe seeing a homeopath, and the homeopath said, "Oh, you're going to Africa. You don't need to take those anti-malarials. You can just take this homeopathic ledum, and it'll just protect you against malaria." And a couple patients did this, and they ended up contracting malaria and getting multi-system failure and almost died. And because in this case, homeopathy has never been designed to protect people from malaria. It's never been proven to have any benefit whatsoever. And so in my mind, it's essentially ineffective. And in this case, it was demonstrated that it didn't work. And as a result, people were harmed because an ineffective treatment was given. So when it comes to things like malaria, vaccinations, meningitis, I don't want to mess around with that. I'm not going to offer a herb as an alternative. I might do something in conjunction, but I wouldn't do it as an alternative. So Not doing anything can also cause harm. And if you look at the premise of naturopathic medicine is first do no harm, it doesn't mean that's what you want to first do, but you might have to give something that's toxic to save someone's life as well. In case of like cancer treatment, yeah, ideally you want to use fruits and vegetables to prevent cancer, but if someone has cancer, you may have to cause a little bit of harm and do surgery and remove the tumor. Otherwise, there's more harm can occur by not doing that treatment. So I think I'm beating this to death now, but just something to think about. Now, another thing that can happen is you can have an adverse reaction if you give a herb because the herb itself is toxic. So that would be something like aconite, where if you took aconite, it's a neurotoxin and it'll kill you. That could be a problem. Another example would be the herb itself that you're trying to recommend is safe, but it may be that there's some kind of toxin that's associated with that batch of herbs. And it could be that the herb might be contaminated with some other toxic herb when they're harvesting it. Or it may be that it's sprayed with pesticides, or it may be that the soil had a lot of mercury in it. So whatever it is, it may be that the herb is safe, but there's something extra in there that's not good. The other concern that we have are drug interactions. And so this could occur, for example, with the St. John's wort or grapefruit juice combined with some other drug where it makes it ineffective or it makes it toxic. And I would say the last two things, which are very emotional things, is that when it comes to pregnancy, you want to watch what you give to a pregnant woman because you could cause harm to the developing fetus. And so there are herbs that we know you can't do this with. And one of the things that I find when it comes to pregnant women is that you have to be extremely clear of the safety or the lack of safety studies that exist for certain things, because if you go and give us a herb that, in my opinion, is safe, like for example, DGL is, it's a flavonoid. I'm pretty confident it'll be safe to take for heartburn. I don't see any major issues with it, but research is limited. And if they go and if they do their own research and they look at licorice and say, oh, licorice shouldn't be given to pregnant women or should be given with caution, and you've recommended DGL, they may get really upset and freak out on you and lose, faith in you, and you could, lose your credibility because there's such an emotional response to it. But meanwhile, the DGL is probably very safe. It's the glycyrrhizin that's been removed from the licorice, which is not found in the DGL, but is found in licorice, that could have potential issues. And the reality is you can get away with, there are people who, and I'm not recommending this by any means, but there are people that smoke and drink, do crack cocaine through the pregnancy, and their kids turn out pretty normal for the most part. Some of them may turn out totally normal, and a percentage of them won't. And that's when that's a very extreme case. And so, a lot of herbs, if you're just doing a little low dose here and there, even if it's sort of like licorice tea, if you have a cup of licorice tea, you're not going to have a miscarriage just from one cup of licorice tea. If you're taking high dose licorice tea on a regular basis, I think you could get yourself into trouble. So you're going to have to factor that in. And I think the most important thing is you need to communicate all these risks to the mother so they can choose to make their own decision on whether it's safe or not. And you document that, because if you tell them it's safe and the evidence is inconclusive or research shows that it's not safe, they're going to be very upset. And then you could also finally cause harm to the infant as well. So not only could you cause a miscarriage, but if a mother was, let's say, breastfeeding or pregnant, and they were taking some herb like golden seal, it could cause harm to the developing fetus and also to an infant who is breastfeeding. So that would be a herb that, for colds and flus, I wouldn't probably recommend it. Realistically, if they took it for a couple of days, it's probably not going to cause that much harm, but at this point, I'm not going to take the risk, and I don't think there's any point. You can find safer alternatives. So typically when it comes to side effects, the more you give of a substance, the more likely you are to increase the risk of side effects. And it could be linear or it could actually be exponential. But the idea is the more of the substance you take, the greater the risk of side effects. And this is kind of like an idea of a broad therapeutic index. So if you look at this, the desired effect is in blue and the side effect is in red. So with something that's very safe, you might find this might be vitamin C. 10 milligrams, 30 milligrams, 100 milligrams, even 1,000 milligrams per day is pretty safe. When you start getting up into 1,000 or 5,000 milligrams, you might start getting some loose stools and diarrhea. But for the most part, the side effects are low and the beneficial effects are high. Now, when you contrast that with something that has a narrow therapeutic index, this might be something like Digitalis, where the desired effect, you need, a little bit of the drug will have a desirable effect, and then the side effects start appearing quite early on. And so as a result, there's that sort of point where there's the ideal dose with minimal amount of side effects with maximum amount of benefit. And if you exceed that, then you're going to get into, there's going to be more side effects than benefit from doing it. So that's sort of an exaggeration of something that would be, actually this, if this was a drug, I would never even recommend this. It's just too toxic, it's too dangerous. But you might have things like chemotherapeutic agents may be in that sort of category there. So the main herbs that I can think of that we've discussed that have a very narrow therapeutic index is going to be monkshood, which is a nerve block, digitalis, which is a cardiotonic, and then ephedra, which is a sympathomimetic. So let's take a break right here at hepatotoxicity. If you guys have some questions, text them to me now, and I'll have a look at them when I get back. Say good morning. Say hello. Say hello. Give him a wave. Give him a wave. Hello. Hello. Oh, what's over there? What's over there? What's over there? Yeah. Yeah. What's this? You want that? Messy hair this morning. Messy hair. So what do you think? Who's that? Who's that, Lexi? Who's that there? It's my coffee. Don't put that in my coffee. Oh, you like coffee, do you? What? You can't play with scissors. You can't play with that. Oh. So look how much more we have to do, okay? What's that? Like the flower? Who's that, Lexi? Who's that there? Who's that? Who's the baby? Who's the baby? Who's the baby? Who's that? Who's that, Lexi? Is that you? Is that you? Is that you, Chubby? That's Dad out there, yeah. Who's that there? Who's that? Don't chew on the pen, please. No, you don't need that. You don't need that. Okay, we gotta start soon. I gotta get rid of you. Okay, I gotta get rid of you. No, you can't have my coffee. Oh. Let's just get this scrolled up to here. I will be back in 2 seconds. Okay, I'm gonna get rid of you. Get rid of you. You want to say goodbye? Want to say bye-bye? Wait, bye-bye. Wait, bye-bye. Come on. Wait, bye-bye. Yeah, you're like, there's nobody out there. Why you make me wait? What's that? Who's that there? Okay, say bye-bye. We gotta go. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye, Lexi. Okay, so we got sound. I got a couple questions here. Katrina's asking, as someone knows they've been exposed to environmental carcinogen like asbestos, is using liver herbs such as dandelion and turmeric a beneficial way of detoxifying and excreting the toxins they may have in their body from the exposure? I would say that asbestos is a unique example where basically you're inhaling the fibers and they get stuck in your lung tissue. So taking liver herbs, because it's not really absorbed or broken down by the body, wouldn't have any effect on asbestos. I don't know what you do for us. I don't think you could do anything for asbestos. It's not a good thing to be exposed to. So if you're looking at something like maybe mercury, which would be an environmental toxin or neurotoxin, whatever you want to call it, I would say that herbs might be beneficial, but so would be some other would help as well. So you kind of have to look at it on an individual basis in general. So I don't know if I answered your question very well, but that's the best I can do. Carly says, you're just talking way too fast. That's not what she said. She said, lots of great information, but you're talking really fast. Hard to keep up. Sorry, I do that sometimes. But I'll see what I can do to slow down a little bit. Any other questions? Let me know. I think sound should be working fine again. Okay, hepatotoxicity. So, we've already discussed certain herbs that can affect the liver, and we're going to, I guess, review them and discuss in a little bit more detail. But there are a number of herbs that have potential to be hepatotoxic. Hepatotoxic, that's how you spell it. And this is based primarily on certain case reports that have come out on these herbs and people taking these herbs, or maybe some in vitro trials as well. So there are a number of herbs that I've used. Most of these I've used at some point, either internally or topically, that have been shown to have potential to have some liver issues. So black cohosh is typically used for female conditions. It's also used for menopausal hot flashes, menstrual cramps. It's a hormone regulator. Greater celandine, I've used it for people with liver issues, which ironically can cause damage to the liver, but I've used it for people with gallstones, and I've used it for digestive issues. Comfrey, I've never used it internally, but I've certainly eaten it myself internally just a little bit. Sassafras, as we mentioned, was in root beer. Chaparral is a herb from the southwestern United States. It's a desert plant, has some antiviral properties. And then kava is a herb from the South Pacific that's been used as a nervine, as an anxiolytic, and there have been case reports with all these. So, in my opinion, based on the phytochemicals we've discussed already, there are certain phytochemicals that seem to have an issue with this. Now, in general, pyrrolizidine alkaloids have that potential. Phenylpropenes, which exist in the essential oils, which is also listed there. Coumarins as well, we mentioned, and isoquinoline alkaloids. I would imagine probably isoquinoline alkaloid and probably any of the quinoline alkaloids would potentially have issues as well. So, although I've used greater celandine for digestive issues, you can see that there are a number of case reports. So it kind of makes me start feeling less confident in recommending it because there are some case reports with it. Now, if I do recommend it, I would want to be careful that I'm using the right dose, and I'm also, if someone is at risk of having liver issues, I might not recommend it. So it's hard to know precisely what we should do about this. So here's studies with comfrey and a number of other ones. So to start off with the pyrrolizidine alkaloids, one of the things is it appears that there are two types of pyrrolizidine alkaloids. You've got one where it's saturated, shown on the left-hand side, and then you've got one that's unsaturated. Now, unsaturated means that you've got a double bond on that, somewhere on that ring structure there. And so with the pyrrolizidine alkaloids, it appears that the unsaturated pyrrolizidine alkaloids are toxic, while the saturated ones don't seem to have a major issue. And presumably this is because when it goes into the liver, I think that double bond is acted on by the phase 1 detoxification enzymes and forms it into a reactive intermediate that can then be an issue. So herbs that contain these unsaturated pyrrolizidine alkaloids, we know that they can cause problems. And so in animals, they typically don't feed on plants that contain these pyrrolizidine alkaloids. It occasionally happens accidentally, or if there's no other food available because maybe there's some kind of drought or other issue going on there's limited plants available. And so certainly farmers have observed animals in their field sort of behaving strangely, and this usually happens because when you start having liver issues, it affects your ability to metabolize ammonia, which is a nitrogen-based compound that can eventually get excreted in the urine when it's metabolized through the liver. And so when the ammonia becomes elevated in the body, it acts as a bit of a neurotoxin and can make the animals behave oddly, like they're intoxicated. And so that might be, you see a cow kind of stumbling around doing weird things in the field, then that would be a sign that potentially they could have pyrrolizidine alkaloid poisoning. So that would be sort of an acute overdose situation. Long term, you may not have any visible symptoms right away, but it could just slowly have issues on the liver that eventually ends up causing liver cirrhosis and possibly liver cancer and death. So chronic low-grade exposure is bad. You know, acute high exposure is also bad. It presents in different ways. Now, in humans, there doesn't appear to be any major acute overdoses that have occurred with these plants. Most of it is more if someone's taking some kind of herbal product long term, that they're starting to develop some kind of drug-induced hepatitis. And what it causes is a veno-occlusion disease. So basically what happens is the liver becomes enlarged and it occludes one of the main veins that's in the liver, and that causes sort of backlogging of the blood and other related issues. So toxicity does happen in humans. Sometimes it happens, I think, when people are accidentally taking the wrong plant. Now, when it comes to medicinal plants, the World Health Organization has basically said there's at least 60 medicinal plants that are taken internally around the world that we know contain pyrrolizidine alkaloids. So there are lots of plants that contain them, and some of these have been banned. For example, comfrey, as we mentioned, has been banned for internal use. Whether it's fair or not, I don't know. Traditional herbalists have used comfrey internally, both in leaf and root form. In leaf form, some people have consumed it as a vegetable in the early spring. The root and the leaf has been taken internally, a little bit like how you might take marshmallow root or leaf as a demulcent, and it also has good vulnerary properties. So we know we apply it topically to help with wound healing. Burns, arthritis, has good anti-inflammatory effects. And internally, you could use it for the same thing, but because of the risk of these pyrrolizidine alkaloids, there's sort of a warning that you're not allowed to market it for internal use. So I don't know what to think of it. As an aside, I remember seeing a few years ago that some herbal product was recommending it contained comfrey because it's called bone knit, so it's used to help with broken bones. And they, someone had made a osteoporosis product and it had comfrey inside it. And so, I thought that was a bit silly because one, comfrey has never been used historically to help with osteoporosis, and two, there's risk associated with it that if you were taking it on a daily basis for 20 years, maybe that would pose high risk. The thing is that a lot of the time with these herbs, you might only take, let's say if you had a stomach ulcer and you were taking comfrey internally, it's unlikely you'd be taking it more than a couple of weeks, and the amount of the pyrrolizidine alkaloids would probably be relatively low in it. So it's unlikely that it would have cause an issue, but we don't know that for certain. in addition to comfrey, there are other herbs like colt's foot, which has been used internally for respiratory complaints and continues to be used for that. And we know that it contains pyrrolizidine alkaloids in it, but it hasn't been banned. So I'm not sure why comfrey has been banned when there are all these other herbs that contain them as well. So now the German Commission, remember we talked about in the first lecture, they basically recommended that we should probably not consume any more than 10 micrograms a day of these pyrrolizidine alkaloids for 4 to 6 weeks per year. And so they're kind of saying, you know, keep it to a low dose and we should be okay. And to be perfectly honest with you, everything is toxic. And I'll just emphasize that. Everything in the universe is going to be toxic at some level. And it just depends on the dose. And, you know, if you want to live a diet that's completely pure and toxin-free, you just can't eat any fruits and vegetables, because even cucumber is high in aluminum. You know, most fruits and vegetables will have heavy metals in them. You can't avoid this stuff. It's all about getting within the safe amounts. And a little bit of this stuff probably won't have a negative effect on you, but you don't want to be taking high amounts of it. So, so I don't recommend comfrey to any patients just because Health Canada told me not to, and I'm going to play by the rules. There's no point in me putting my license on the line for, you know, for comfrey when I could give some other herb that's just as effective. But just be aware that there are other herbs like colt's foot that have been recommended for, that is recommended for internal use that could still be an issue. The good thing is that a lot of this is reversible, so maybe not the cancer and stuff, but if someone has a hepatic venous occlusion disease, like in a child, it does reverse itself when you discontinue it. And in this case, one of the things is a mother was picking colt's foot for a child, but accidentally picked an entirely different herb. It looks like colt's foot, and so this is a case of an adulteration with a herb that looked like colt's foot, but wasn't, and had even higher amount of pyrrolizidine alkaloids than colt's foot does, and caused damage to the child. Now, what's kind of neat is licorice has been shown to have a hepatoprotective effect, and it may help reduce some of the negative effects that occurs on some of these things. So that's a positive thing. I don't know why it's thrown in here. It's kind of random. Even my slides got moved around. Now, another group of compounds I want to discuss are the phenylpropenes. Now, from what I've observed, is there are certain phenylpropenes that appear to be more toxic than other ones. And the phenylpropenes, as you can see here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. This saffron molecule is what you find in root beer, and it comes from this plant called sassafras, and this grows in Hyde Park. You can gather, if you see the leaf, it's very distinctive kind of shape. It's unlike a lot of the other shapes, trees. And take a leaf and crush it up in your hand and smell it. It has this nice sort of aromatic smell to it. You don't see a lot of plants. Well, that's not true. You do see. You don't. Certainly, there's like the pine trees and the coniferous trees have a lot of essential oils. But I usually don't think of deciduous trees being aromatic, and this is one example that is. And this is the plant that was originally used to make root beer with in North America. And you can also use saffron as a precursor to make certain drugs like MDMA, ecstasy. It's a very simple reaction. You actually gather sassafras, distill the essential oils, isolate the saffron, and you do a couple of reactions and you can get ecstasy out of it. And that's how it's usually made on the street. It's probably not made on the street. It's made in someone's garage probably, but it's a pretty simple chemical reaction. Now, when it comes to the saffron, this is known to cause liver issues. And what I've observed is that other phenylpropenes, remember, here you've got your phenyl group here, there's a methyl group here, so ignore that guy. And then you got, it's a propene because there's a double bond here. And when it's at the terminal end of the propanol group, it seems to be more toxic than if it's located, for example, here, right in the middle. So I suspect that when it's a terminal propene, like this guy here, it may be that when it undergoes phase one detoxification, this becomes activated, and there's a free radical here that then potentially can interact with the liver and cause problems. So kind of like how Tylenol becomes a reactive intermediate, I think these terminal phenylpropines could be an issue. And so phenylpropanoids in general, what we know is that if you took basically less than a teaspoon of this oil, it would basically cause liver failure and death almost immediately. So that's not good. So you don't want to do that. Taking small amounts long-term or moderate amounts long-term can also, maybe you're not going to have that acute liver failure, but you might end up having increased risk of liver cancer. So we know that the FDA banned it for this reason. So as I mentioned, other things like eugenol, myristicin, estragol, phytochemicals that have a similar structure have also been shown in animal studies to cause cancer. And it could just be that this is a dose-dependent thing. Now, when you look at apiol, eugenol, safrole, these three compounds, in addition to being hepatotoxic, they may also pose a threat to pregnant women and their developing infants. So eating high amounts of parsley is known to be an emmenagogue and teratogenic, and it's probably related to these compounds here. Now, I'm not overly concerned if someone eats some celery and has a little bit of parsley, because the amount of these compounds is relatively small. And again, these are all dose-dependent things. If you look at eugenol in the middle, we know that in high amounts this can be an issue. But when you look at herbs like holy basil, it has anti-cancer properties and it has other compounds in there. So I think that when you're eating foods that contain these, they also contain flavonoids. And we know that, for example, in celery, there are certain bioflavonoids that have an antioxidant effect, and they may slow down phase 1 detox and help to balance it a little bit. So in general, I think that most food sources of these compounds is probably going to be safe in moderate amounts, but you still have to be cautious about it. So these three guys I worry about, even though I don't worry about giving people parsley, eating a little bit of celery, having some cinnamon on your foods, probably okay, but we'll get back to that in a second. So phenylpropines, I think, have risks for your liver, and also I'd watch out with your babies as well. Now, what's interesting is, just like Tylenol, when you take an overdose of these phenylpropines, it depletes your body of glutathione and NAC. And so I believe what happens is that it becomes a reactive intermediate, just like Tylenol does, and it uses cysteine and glutathione to detoxify. And so if your body runs out of the cysteine or glutathione, that's where you get yourself into trouble. So I would think that if someone were to overdose on any of these things, any of these essential oils, making sure they have adequate glutathione in the system would have a protective effect, I suspect. And so the overdose here is, if someone overdosed in clove oil, you can buy it in the pharmacy, and it's used as a topical analgesic for teething in children. But if a child just took the bottle and drank the whole thing, like 10 mils, that would be very bad. But the antidote in this case would be cysteine, which is kind of good. So cysteine NAC is a good supplement to have kicking around in the clinic for a number of reasons, especially for overdoses. But it will only work for some type of overdoses. Now, the next thing we're going to look at are the coumarins. Now, we mentioned coumarins already. Coumarin itself specifically appears to have some issues or some concerns related to the liver. I honestly don't know why coumarin's so bad for you, like mechanistically. We know that coumarins are found in a number of herbs, including clover. Red clover has coumarin in it, so does certain types of cinnamon does, crankbark, horse chestnut. And the main safety concerns with this is that it could interfere with blood thinners, and it also has a little bit of hepatotoxicity effects to it. Now, what we've seen is that Chinese cinnamon, which has higher amounts of the coumarin, seems to be more of an issue than the more expensive and safer form, which is the true cinnamon called Ceylon cinnamon, which is a different species altogether. And so, just as an aside, there are a couple different botanical names you can use for Sri Lankan cinnamon. It used to be Cinnamomum zeylanicum, and now they've changed it to Cinnamomum verum. You gotta change the cinnamomum. That's like a mouthful. It's like a tongue twister. I always stumble over that. But anyways, so the Sri Lankan cinnamon is one that we usually sell to patients in our clinic here. We buy little bags of it. We buy big bags of it, and then we put it in the smaller bags and sell it to the patients at a good cost. Basically, any cinnamon that you're probably buying at the grocery store, unless it specifically says it's Sri Lankan, it's probably going to be Chinese or some kind of Indonesian or Southeast Asian cinnamon, which may have higher amounts of the coumarin. So when it comes to these coumarins, certain warnings have actually been put out in countries like Denmark, where they found that heavy consumers of may reach a daily coumarin intake that could be toxic. And so there's a tolerable daily intake, the TDI, that if you're eating a lot of cinnamon buns, or even if you were taking, let's say, a cinnamon supplement for diabetes, because cinnamon has been shown to have some benefit with diabetes, and a lot of the research that they've done has been done on Chinese cinnamon, not on the Sri Lankan cinnamon. And in my opinion, I don't think the coumarin has any therapeutic value. The main benefits of cinnamon is going to be the red color that's in cinnamon are anthocyanins, and also maybe the cinnamaldehyde. Some of the essential oils may have beneficial effect. But so although the research has been done with more with Chinese cinnamon, it appears that I would be more likely to recommend the Sri Lankan if I'm going to get someone to have it on a daily basis, a few grams, because that, in my opinion, could be at that higher tolerable daily intake that that's allowed. So now another thing to look at is, as we mentioned before, it's not just the herbs themselves that are toxic. It's things that are sometimes sold with the herbs or are carried along with the herbs that can be an issue. So this is basically contaminants or some kind of adulteration with a different plant that you should be looking at. And the main things that we can look at are, for example, the first thing is microorganisms. There are a number of bacteria that could reside on fresh or processed plants that could be problematic. Now, to illustrate a story of this, I was in Chinatown and buying some herbs down there, and I had goji berries, big bag of goji berries, like a couple bucks, and I thought, oh, that's cheap, I'm going to buy a whole bunch, because normally if you buy goji berries in the health food store, it's quite expensive, and goji berries are good antioxidants and good immunostimulants. So I bought a bag of them along with some other things, and then I was eating them like raisins on the way home because they taste pretty good. And then I think the next day or later on, I can't remember when it was, I started getting a lot of digestive distress and ended up getting like traveler's diarrhea, that even though I only traveled to Chinatown in Toronto, and that was it. And then I kind of re-examined the goji berry package, and it basically said that they must be boiled before consuming orally, because I don't know where they're grown in China, but they could be using human feces as a fertilizer or animal feces as fertilizer, and they're not properly washed off. So in this case, I probably got E. coli or some other kind of bug that you might get from like same sort of thing as that causes a lot of infectious diarrhea. So that's my experience with microorganisms contaminating herbs. So if you're going to go to Chinatown, watch what you buy, and you're probably better off boiling it. Anything there, I think, although I do buy some herbs from Chinatown, you got to watch the quality of these things for a couple things. So you got microorganisms that directly live on it that could infect you. The next thing that could happen is that you could end up becoming poisoned, not by the bacteria themselves, but by some sort of toxin that they produce. So, for example, certain mycotoxins, like those produced by Aspergillus, in particular aflatoxins, or other ones that are produced by blue-green algae, could pose an issue to you. So, for example, if you were to buy a whole bunch of herbs that were imported from Southeast Asia, it's a very humid, damp, moist, hot climate. And if herbs aren't properly stored, you're more likely to get certain funguses growing on it, like aspergillus, that will produce these aflatoxins. So also, just in general, even if you gather your own herbs, and I've done this before, where I'll go out and gather a whole bunch of burdock or whatever it is, cut it up, and I remember putting it somewhere to dry, but it wasn't very well ventilated, and I didn't have an airflow around it, and so it was hot, but maybe the humidity was too high in there. And when I went back and checked on it a couple days later, it was all covered with mold because it just wasn't drying fast enough, and the humidity wasn't there. So so whether you buy it or whether you gather it and dry it yourself or someone else does, it poses a risk that molds and funguses can grow on it if it's not properly prepared. Another thing that can be an issue is that there can be chemical additives, and there's a few examples of this where in Chinese patents they've added a little Viagra to it, synthetic Viagra, to kind of give it a little extra kick, you know, and they're promoting it as a natural product for low libido. Also, there has been evidence that there can be dyes or preservatives added to the herbs that don't have any kind of therapeutic effect, but it's more used to deceive the customer. And another thing that can be an issue is if you're not buying organically grown herbs, who knows what they could be spraying on your herbal teas, and then you go and drink it. You know, those are going to get into your body, and so I don't really like. I try to buy all my herbal teas organically grown. I don't care if squashes are organically grown or oranges are, because I'm going to be peeling them. But when it comes to herbs, you know, who wants to take medicine or take something that's supposed to be good for you that's covered in toxic stuff? So that's just my opinion. Finally, also, when you're buying certain capsules and pills, when they do their extraction, they could be using some sort of organic solvent or inorganic solvent. They could be using anything, I guess. And so, in general, things like toluene or benzene, there could be small amounts in the herbal preparations that probably a little bit won't hurt you, but I just don't really want that in my body if I can avoid it. So those are the chemical effects. And then finally, you could have adulteration with plant material. And so you might be wanting golden seal root, and then they give you golden seal leaf, you know, which probably isn't going to be toxic, but it won't be as effective. Or they might have the right genus, but they have a particular species that's or subspecies or what do you call that? Variety that's less effective. Or they've got the right genus, but they have the totally wrong species, or they get the wrong genus and species, and they have the wrong plant altogether. And this is occurring. And the American Botanical Council's done some neat publications on contamination and adulterations of herbal medicine. Now I want to give you some examples that I've taken from Herbalgram. Herbalgram is published by the American Botanical Council, and this is ongoing. They're updating this regularly, but you may have heard of grapefruit seed extract, and that it's useful as an antimicrobial. And I can say with pretty much 100% certainty now that they've looked at this a few times now, and I wouldn't recommend a grapefruit seed extract to people as an antimicrobial. Historically, grapefruit seed extracts were never used as an antimicrobial, and when they've done testing on it, what they've found is that the products on the market, they're adulterated with a allowed but synthetic industrial disinfectant like triclosan and these other compounds mentioned below. And so although grapefruit seed extracts work as an antimicrobial, it's not the grapefruit seed itself that works, it's the additives that they put in that are used as a preservative that seem to be effective. And so you can read about this, even Wikipedia, if you go to grapefruit seed extract, there's research on it there. It's mentioned in the Herbalgram, and there's other evidence that's come out recently on it as well. So so I wouldn't use this. And I know a lot of people about 5 or 10 years ago were using this when they went traveling. They'd take it with them, they'd add it to their drinking water, or they'd wash their fruits and vegetables in it. But you know, it works, but it's a chemical. So there's other chemical disinfectants you could choose from as well. There's a number of other series issues that they've talked about, the adulteration of various herbs. I'll mention a couple of these that are worth mentioning. So skullcap, we have a skullcap that grows in North America called Scutellaria lateriflora, and it's generally used as a nervine, and it's a good formula, and you might find it in sleep formulas, anxiety formulas, and it's useful. There's also a Chinese skullcap, which is Scutellaria bacalensis, and Chinese skullcap, it's used more as a antibacterial, anti-inflammatory herb. It does have a lot of the same flavonoids that you have in North American skullcap, so I suspect that they both have similar actions, but we've just emphasized more on one particular effect of it. And if you look, Chinese skullcap looks very similar. It happens to be that the flowers on the Chinese skullcap is much larger than what you're going to see. They're about 5 times as large as what you're going to see on the skullcap that grows in North America. Now, one of the issues is that there's another plant that looks a lot like it and grows in a similar area called American germander. And American germander is known to be hepatotoxic. And we've seen a number of case reports of people having liver issues associated with consuming some kind of skullcap product, and it's likely attributed to the American germander that was harvested instead of or along with the skullcap. And so recently in the Herbalgram, they did a little study where they looked at 13 supplements on the market that were labeled skullcap, and what they found was about 5 of these products had the correct one, Scutellaria lateriflora, in it exclusively. One of them had Chinese skullcap in it, so they used the right genus but the wrong species, and then 4 of them were contaminated with American germander. So that's a really high amount. That doesn't give me a lot of faith in some of these herbal manufacturers out there. Another example of this is bilberry. So bilberry is similar to our blueberry. It's the same genus, it's a slightly different species than we have that grows in North America here. It grows in Northern Europe. It's not quite as sweet. It's a little bit drier than our blueberries here. And it's very, very high. It's about 4 or 5 times higher in the non-hydrolyzable tannins, the anthocyanins, than blueberry is. Now, bilberry has been promoted as a product that helps with eye health, that helps with cholesterol, blood pressure. It's a great antioxidant, a number of other things. And what's interesting, when they've done studies on the products here, what they found is that sometimes the blueberry products are contaminated with artificial dyes, or they've thrown charcoal in because charcoal looks kind of dark and black, so it's a way that they can bulk it up a bit and mislead people, because bilberry is going to be more expensive than charcoal. And then they've also used other types of plants, which may or may not be bad. Blueberry, elderberry extracts may have been put in, but if you're trying to get the benefits of bilberry, you don't want to be using other blueberries or elderberries or currants or whatever it is that they're using. So that's a concern there. This is one that I find particularly interesting, where black cohosh has been used in herbal medicine for a long time. Now, in the old herbal books, it's referred to as Cimicifuga racemosa. Now, the newer botanical binomial for it has been changed to Actia racemosa. So they changed the genus from Cimicifuga to Actia. And I don't know why they can't just use the old ones and make it easier for us. So when you're learning herbal medicine, sometimes black cohosh is referred to as Cimicifuga racemosa because they're not keeping up to date with the scientific names. They're using the names that were quoted 100 years ago in the old texts, or even 20 years ago. So either word is acceptable, and you can use either one. Now, recent studies showed that there was a number of black cohosh products on the market, and when they tested it, what they found was that it contained completely different plants, and they didn't even contain black cohosh. Now, I want to emphasize that black cohosh grows in North America, and it's relatively expensive. There are different cohoshes that exist and grow in Asia and China that may or may not have the same types of phytochemicals. They have different indications and a number of other things. What I find most interesting is there's a plant called shengma, and sometimes referred to as Chinese cohosh. But if you look, the name of it is Actia cimicifuga. Now, how confusing is that? So you've got black cohosh that grows in North America. That's either Actia racemosa, so the genus is Actia and the species is racemosa, or Cimicifuga racemosa. But here we have a Chinese plant called Actia cimicifuga, which uses the genus from the recent botanical and the old botanical name of black cohosh for its genus and species. So I think for the average person, even for me, I would find that confusing. If I saw it contain Actia cimicifuga on the label of a bottle, I would probably go, oh yeah, that's correct, because my mind would kind of mix that up. But shengma is not the herb that you want. It won't be effective, and it probably is going to be toxic. And there's some other genus and species or other species that have been used in adulterating black cohosh products. And so there's a number of studies on the market that show black cohosh has been effective, and they're effective for treating menopausal hot flashes. Some studies show it's ineffective. There's also been case reports of it causing hepatotoxicity. So my big concern is, how do we know what product they're using? Are they actually testing to confirm that they have the right product? So, because what ends up happening with manufacturers, and I understand how it works in a business world, you grab a catalog of plants and you see black cohosh $40 a pound from Canada, or you see black cohosh from China $5 a pound, you know, it's a no-brainer. You want to go with the $5 a pound one, because why spend the extra money for the same thing? And so I think that's probably what happened in some of these cases with the black cohosh adulteration, and it probably is still going on now. And so the suspected hepatotoxicity associated with black cohosh, some people speculate that it's not actually the North American black cohosh that's the issue, that it might actually be related to the ones that are adulterating it from Asia. So that's, I guess, good. But there is some major quality concerns with that. Now, the next thing to talk about are some potential allergic allergies. I'm just going to check how much I need to get through. So one of the allergic reactions that can occur is something called, it's an allergic contact dermatitis. And you've got a type 1 allergy, which is responsible for seasonal allergies, anaphylactic shock. You've got a type 2 allergy, which is IgG mediated, which is a lot of food sensitivities that you can test for related to the type 2 sensitivities. And there's another one called the type 3 hypersensitivity, and this is also immune response. And this is in response to basically resins from trees or plants that, when they come into contact with your skin, they form a hapten, which is sort of a complex that then becomes antigenic or immunologically active, reactive. And so what happens the first time, you might get poison ivy on your skin, you become sensitized to it, and then on your second exposure you get bad inflammation and blisters from it. So if you look at the image on the left, the active ingredient in poison ivy is called urushiol, and this compound here, it's a resin that when it comes in contact and then reacts to proteins in the skin, people get a reaction to it. Now, there are two main families of plants that I know of that can cause these types of reactions. One is the Anacardiaceae family, which poison ivy is in. The other one is the Asteraceae family. So if you've ever wondered what poison ivy looks like, this is what it looks like here. Now, in the fall, it can take, or if it's dry, it'll take on more of a rustier sort of color to it, but it can be green. And there are different ways that this can appear. It can have nice smooth leaves, or it can have rough more kind of jaggedy edges to the leaves. You can see that as well. One thing that's worth mentioning is, I think everyone knows that poison ivy has 3 leaves, but there's an awful lot of plants that have 3 leaves. What you want to look for is these 2 leaves are very, very closely attached at the stem, while the 3rd leaf has a longer stem on it compared to these 2. And that's sort of the classic. I don't see a lot of other plants with that sort of presentation. 3 leaves, and then the one in the middle has a longer stem. So that's how I know how to identify it. And like I said, you can have little rough edges to the leaves. It can grow as a shrub. It can grow as a low-lying plant. Different ways it can present itself. And so poison ivy, not everybody reacts to it, but it is pretty common. If you have it on your property, one thing to remember is don't burn it, because if you burn it, you're going to basically make the active or the toxic compound volatile, and if you inhale it in your lungs, and you'll get poison ivy in your lungs, and then you can get yourself into real trouble. First Nations people used to use it when they're at war with each other. Make a big fire, throw poison ivy on it, and then let the smoke blow into their enemies, which is pretty mean, but kind of neat. So the Anacardiaceae family includes a number of other plants. Cashew fruit, so the nut picture on the left there, that's cashew fruit. I think I took it down the Amazon. Down there you eat the fruit and then you throw away the nut, or you throw away the nuts and then give them to us up here to eat. So cashew fruit's in this family. So is mangoes. So certain people, for example, mango resin, you may see little drops of resin that can appear on the surface of the mango. Some people are sensitive to that. So if you're really sensitive to poison ivy and you come in contact with that, wash your hands after you've peeled a mango to make sure you don't spread it around. Poison ivy and poison sumac are also in that family. So cashew fruit and mangoes are 2 fruits that may have a little bit of resin that you can react to. Now, with regards to herbal medicine, the Asteraceae family has a lot of plants that also have the potential to cause a rare reaction. Now, most people, if they come in contact with poison ivy, will probably react to it on the second encounter. With the Asteraceae family, it's very rare. I don't think I've actually seen it in private practice, but because a lot of members of the Asteraceae family contain sesquiterpene lactones that we've described already, those compounds can have the potential to form haptens when they come in contact with skin and cause a similar reaction to what occurs with poison ivy. So keep your eye, if someone has a reaction, it's so rare that I don't even warn people about it, but if they have a skin product that contains, let's say, chamomile or arnica in it, and they get a weird skin reaction to it, I just tell them to discontinue it, and they may be one of those, 1 in 1,000 people that react to it. So chamomile, calendula, these guys can have the reaction as well. Some of these are used internally, some of them are used as herbal products. Another type of reaction is called phytophotodermatitis. So this is my hand, and I was picking, I think, a herb called prickly ash, and it contains pheranocoumarins, a lot like the ones that you're going to get in grapefruit, not grapefruit seed, but grapefruit. It has a citrusy smell to it. A lot of members of the grapefruit family will contain these compounds. And although they're relatively safe, if they come in contact with your skin and you then are exposed to UV light, it'll cause pretty serious burns. And so in addition to grapefruit, rue or ruta, which is also a medicinal plant, can cause these burns. On the left, this is wild parsnip, also giant hogweed. Looks very similar. It's just about 10 or 5 times as big. A lot of the members of the Apiaceae family. So this is cumin, celery, carrots. That's the family, but other herbs in that family may contain these pheranocoumarins. And in addition to having an effect on liver enzymes, if you get them on contact with your skin and you don't wash it off right away, and then you're out hanging around in the sun, you will get a pretty nasty burn from it. And so they're relatively safe. If you ever want to gather herbs that are high in pheranocoumarins, do it on a cloudy day. You won't have a problem. in my case, after I got it on my hand, it caused pretty serious burns that blistered up. After they went away, there was little pigment in my skin had changed there, so it was much darker. So I had a nice little tan where I had these little blisters before. Now it's finally gone away, but so that's something to be aware of. Giant hogweed is a plant that I think often, I think a lot of people have heard about it now, but what can happen is you can see this, they grow about 10 feet tall. They're big, big plants. They look a lot like the wild parsnip on the left there. They have this umbrella-like flower to it, and kids like playing with it because you break them down, they make great swords, or you can look through them like a telescope, play them like a flute. But what ends up happening is if you get the resin on your eye or in your mouth and you're outside in the sun, you're going to get a really severe burn, and it can cause blindness in children as well. Or you just get on your hands, you rub your eyes, you're in trouble. So it's good to, if you see it around, cut it down, and also warn kids about it. Now, another type of toxin that you got to watch out for in plants are cyanogenic glycosides. Where we find these is a number of plants, including wild cherry bark. You also find them in members of the rose family, like almonds, peaches, apricots. I didn't mention it here, but elderberry leaf and stem has significant amounts of cyanogenic glycosides in it as well, so you don't consume that part of the plant. And so what's the issue with the cyanogenic glycosides is that it's basically a glycoside that contains a hydrogen cyanide molecule. And this is a very, very deadly poisonous gas that in minuscule amounts can cause death because it basically disrupts mitochondrial function and acts as a nerve toxin. So symptoms of overdose could include, or toxicity may include, the person stumbling around, or they can't move a part of their body, having troubles with their heart, and then can possibly lead to death. So just as an aside, hydroxycobalamin, which is the inactive form of B12, will bind up hydrogen cyanide. So if someone were to overdose, in theory, you might be able to take hydroxycobalamin. Not the methylcobalamin and not the cyanocobalamin. Just so you know, the cyanocobalamin, which is what you usually buy in B12 shots at the drugstore, contains a hydrogen cyanide group on it. So you want to get the hydroxycobalamin. Now, small amounts of hydrogen cyanide, like really, really small amounts, probably aren't going to cause any issues. And it is one of the active ingredients in wild cherry bark that acts as a cough suppressant. But again, it's minuscule amounts. And if you're eating any almonds or apple seeds, you're going to get a little bit of cyanide from that. But in high amounts, it can be an issue. In Africa, you've probably seen these plants like cassava. It's used in the Caribbean, Central America, and Africa. They make chips out of it. And it's an important starch in a lot of countries around the world, especially if they're having troubles growing rice and corn. Tapioca is derived from it. And just to be aware that this plant does have cyanogenic glycosides in it. It's been bred to be relatively low in it, but also the way it's prepared is usually the roots are chopped up and soaked in water for a while to release an enzyme that'll help to break down the cyanide in there and make it safe. Now, in Africa, there is a disease called Kunzo, which is a neurological disease that causes paralysis when people tend to eat more of the bitter cassava. This is not as desirable as the other types of cassava, but when people start starving to death and looking for other plants to eat, they will have the bitter cassava that has higher amounts of these compounds in it that can be toxic. So, so the big thing with cassava, you got to make sure you prepare it properly and soak it. The other thing is you want to make sure that you get a variety that's relatively low in it. So we got 9 minutes left. I think I can get through stuff. So drug interactions, we've already discussed this. One of the things that we want to look at is, I think doctors are scared of recommending any natural products because it could interact with food. We've already discussed that some negative effects that herbs could have is they could decrease the absorption, they could increase the efficacy, decrease the efficacy of certain drugs like St. John's wort and antivirals and make them less effective, or you could increase the efficacy of a drug like a statin, but also increase the toxicity. Some other things that herbs can do is that it can decrease the toxicity of drugs. So we've known that there are a number of herbs that, when combined with, let's say, cancer drugs, they actually decrease the side effects, and in some cases it could actually increase the efficacy of those drugs. And let's say if somebody had really bad arthritis, maybe combining turmeric and ginger with ibuprofen or with Tylenol could lower the side effects and also reduce the need for those drugs. So I think that's a great interaction. So people with arthritis, my goal is to reduce the amount of pain medication they take, because most pain medications have some serious side effects, and so we want to reduce the dependency on them. There's a book here by Francis Brinker. He's a naturopath and more of a researcher than a naturopath, I would imagine, and he's basically wrote a few of these books. I think he's on the 4th edition or 5th edition now. This is a good book to pick up and have on hand. It just reviews some of the research associated with herbs and drugs, and it's a bit heavy to read, but it's good to sort of give you a rough idea of what's going on with this stuff. A few of the things that I want to emphasize is that anyone who's on Coumadin or warfarin, which is a pretty potent blood thinner, you want to watch out for drug interactions, because you need to get the Coumadin in the right dose. If the Coumadin's too active, then you run the risk of having some sort of serious bruising or even a hemorrhagic stroke. And if you get too little, then it won't be effective, and you can get into problems that way. And so there's a lot of things that will interact with Coumadin. Even just eating kale, which is rich in vitamin K, can interfere with the decrease the efficacy of Coumadin. So in general, vegetables that are high in vitamin K will interact with it. Now, there are a few different things that you got to watch out for herb standpoint, is that there are a number of herbs that have been shown to have a blood thinning effect. And so the list of them are things like garlic and ginger, dong quai, ginkgo, feverfew, willow bark. These are all pretty common herbs. Some of them are eaten in the diet, some of them are taken as a supplement form. And if you combine that with Coumadin, then you could increase the risk of bleeding. There are also some herbs that might decrease the effects of Coumadin, and so this is things like ginseng or other adaptogens. Probably would follow the same sort of, would probably have the same effects. Vitamin K, which, as I mentioned, is in kale and leafy green vegetables, but also in green tea. And then St. John's wort could affect, I don't think it's directly affecting the bleeding time, but what it's doing is affecting the metabolism of the Coumadin, and that could be an issue. So these substances are either affecting bleeding time directly or interacting with liver enzymes to have the effect. Now, just as an aside, there are a number of herbs that contain coumarins. Coumarins I don't think have a blood thinning effect, but what can happen is that if you gather a whole bunch of herbs, like let's say red clover or yellow clover, and you don't dry it properly and a fungus gets on there and starts to ferment things, these funguses can produce dicoumarins. These are like they'll take a couple of coumarins and conjugate them and make these dicoumarins, which do seem to have a anticoagulant effect, and they block vitamin K in the body to cause bleeding. And so if you look at the dicoumarins, structurally they're very similar to warfarin and vitamin K, and that's the effect that's going on there. So it may be that red clover is fine, coumarins are fine, but if they are metabolized by certain funguses, it may be more of an issue. So in general, a substance that has coumarins in it, I would be cautious or reluctant to give it to someone who's taking warfarin. Now, a few miscellaneous concerns. There's a really good Chinese formula called minor bupleurum formula, or Sho Saikoto, SST, which is used in Japan for hepatitis C, and it does seem to have a hepatoprotective effect and help and an antiviral effect and decrease the progression of liver cancer. One thing they found, when patients with hepatitis C, they may be given interferon treatment to help fight off the virus, but what they found is that if they take interferon treatment and they're taking this SST formula at the same time, there's an increased risk of a certain type of pneumonitis or inflammation of the lungs that can be problematic. So they only found that because of case reports. So that would be an example of a herbal combination to avoid with conventional drugs. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is pregnancy. As I mentioned before, pregnancy is an area that you want to be really careful with, mainly because there's a lot of emotions around pregnancy. And the way that you can cause harm to a baby with herbs is you could have a direct teratogenic effect. And a teratogen is a substance that basically the definition is generates monsters. That's what terato means, monster, and genic means to produce. And so this will actually damage the developing fetus and have negative effects that is not good. The other thing that can occur is it could have an abortifacient effect, and this would potentially terminate the pregnancy by inducing, by causing maybe uterine contractions. Now, a lot of the emmenagogues, which stimulate menstrual flow, could potentially act as an abortifacient, so you'd want to be careful about using those in the first and second trimester. Some of the herbs that are contraindicated during pregnancy have been used historically in the third trimester to help with delivery, and there's some concerns I have with that. Another definition is a parturian or Partus preparatus, and this basically are herbs that help to prepare the uterus for labor or to assist with childbirth. And so some of these, like blue cohosh, has been used historically in the third trimester, but you would never want to use this in the first and second trimester. Even in the third trimester, I have my concerns about recommending it. There's a book written by Ed Mills, who used to be the director of research at the college. Jean-Jacques Dubois, who's a good friend of mine who I used to carpool with every day when I was a student at the college. He ended up getting his PhD in pharmacology and focused primarily on herbal medicine and pregnancy and lactation, and a few other people that I mentioned in this book. But this book, you don't really need to buy it. This is the summary charts that I think are good to take away. Based on the best available evidence, they reviewed all the literature and found that with regards to pregnancy, there's a list of herbs that we know are safe. So cranberry, echinacea, garlic, ginger, you can read this yourself. And what's good about this is if a woman has a urinary tract infection, I'd feel comfortable recommending cranberry because it's not going to cause any harm. Or if they have nausea, I would recommend ginger. If they're maybe got low fatigue and we've ruled out iron deficiency, I might recommend Korean ginseng or Siberian ginseng. Some books say it's not safe, so it's good to know. They even say that St. John's wort is safe to give during pregnancy, which I would normally avoid doing them. And senna, which is a stimulating laxative, some books will say it's not safe to give during pregnancy, but apparently the research says otherwise. So there's a list of herbs that are considered to be safe. Here's a list of herbs that you should use caution. Now, the funny thing is aconite is something that I would never use, even in healthy people, but I guess in China they've used it in the past, and I guess because it doesn't pass the blood-brain or the placenta, maybe that's why, but you want to use it with caution. There's a bunch of other herbs here like coffee, green tea. Because of the caffeine intake, you can consume some caffeine. 1 or 2 cups a day is not going to hurt the baby, but if you're getting higher amounts of caffeine, does increase the risk of complications in preterm delivery and things like that. So you can read a list there. Flax, you want to be careful because I guess it's phytoestrogenic, so you want to use it with caution. So you can look at a few more of these guys. Now, I think the most important ones are the herbs that are unsafe, and we know for certain that any of the herbs that contain isoquinoline alkaloids, barberry, golden seal, Oregon grape, these guys are totally off limits. So if a woman who's pregnant who has a cold, you cannot use these with 100% certainty. I think they have the potential to be teratogenic and act as an emmenagogue, and that's the main issue. Also, things like borage internally, they say it can't be safe because it contains pure Lutein alkaloids. It may be that borage contains doesn't contain very high amounts of the unsaturated pure Lutein alkaloids, but whatever, I'm not going to use it internally. Now, borage oil would be safe because the oil doesn't contain the alkaloids because they're not water soluble, so I'm not concerned about someone supplementing with borage oil if they wanted to. Essential oils, I probably wouldn't recommend someone consume high amounts of parsley, so don't have like 4 bowls of tabbouleh every single day that's rich in parsley, but a little bit's not going to hurt you here and there. I would definitely avoid taking any of the essential oils from this. Deadly nightshade, if anything says deadly in its name, any herbs are called deadly something, it's best to avoid it during pregnancy. I think that's just in general, just avoid them. So the tropane alkaloids, which you're also going to get in other herbs like datura, you wouldn't want to be taking these anticholinergic herbs internally. Ephedra, not safe to use. So if someone wants a cold and flu medication, I wouldn't recommend over-the-counter ones that contain ephedrine or pseudoephedrine during pregnancy. Foxglove, I don't know why you give that to a pregnant woman, but you want to avoid that. And also quinolizidine alkaloids and blue cohosh, it's been considered to be unsafe to give during pregnancy. Now, one of the challenges I can say with blue cohosh is that it has been recommended by midwives and by naturopathic doctors to give to women in the 3rd trimester to help promote a healthy delivery. Or let's say if the baby is a week late, someone might recommend blue cohosh. The problem is there's a whole bunch of safety concerns with blue cohosh, and that there are case reports of it causing some fetal heart issues and bruising and a number of other things. So I really don't think I would feel comfortable recommending it to a patient. And if I ever did, I'd have to emphasize that it may not be safe and that there is safety concerns with it. But a lot of naturopaths and midwives still use it, and I don't think they're aware of the safety concerns with it. So I'm not saying I wouldn't ever use it. I'm just saying I have some serious concerns with it, and I would want to make sure it's the right dose. And if I'm recommending it to a patient for whatever reason, if I ever did, you have to explain those risks. Otherwise, if anything goes wrong, the patient's going to be really upset with you. So there's my daughter on the left. I think that's at like 2 or 3 months. She's changed a lot since then. So the summary, in general, with pregnancy and lactation, I would say if you don't know if it's safe or not, don't use it. Like, just avoid it. You're better to do nothing than to do something that might work but cause harm. So stick with the things that are known to be safe, and I think your patients will appreciate you more for that. If there's something that you have to use caution with, then communicate that with the patient and say, look, this might be okay. There is some caution concerns. We're only going to be using a short period of time. I think it's fine. I don't see any major issues, but you have to make that decision. Now, just because some herbs are considered to be safe and there's other herbs that are unsafe, there's a lot of herbs that we have no idea if they're safe or not. And I would say that herbs that contain alkaloids in general are probably going to pose some risk during pregnancy and lactation. Certain herbs rich in essential oils, if you're taking those in high amounts internally, are going to be issues, and also cardiac glycosides. So I would just avoid those in general. Double check your research on it, but you can also make some educated guess. If it contains any of those, for certain it's probably shouldn't be allowed. Do you guys have any questions? Oh, went over a little bit, sorry. So Carly is asking a couple good questions. Is there a way to look out for adulteration when buying natural products? Are there third parties that assess these commercial products for adulteration? Right now, I'd say in North America, I don't know exactly what's going on, but in general, there isn't a lot of assessment going on by third parties, and so, which is unfortunate. So I don't really know how we know if we're getting a good product or not. Certain products are being standardized, and I would say that's one of the advantages of standardization, is that they're more likely to have the right herbs in there. But then, you can still cheat at standardization as well. When I look at traditional herbalists, they often will make good herbal products. Like I like, for example, one of the tincture manufacturers, I really like their products. I remember once I got a bottle of barberry from them, and when I opened it, I could smell it. I could smell that it had like a moldy smell to it. I suspect that the roots that they purchased, maybe they purchased or harvested themselves, that either they went moldy in the ground or they didn't dry properly, and as a result, the product had this moldy-like smell to it, and I had to send it back to them. And I think they weren't doing it. They're a good company, and they weren't dishonest, and it was just a mistake. So, but the challenge why there's no one doing third-party testing is who's going to pay for it, and it costs a lot of money, and it takes time, and you check every single batch that comes in, or do you check some of them? So, these are good questions to ask the manufacturers, but a lot of the time manufacturers are buying their herbs from some other company. And like most of the supplement companies out there don't do their own manufacturing. They basically hire another company to put it into a capsule for them and put it into a bottle, and then they stick their sticker and label on it. And so even other good companies that I know, that I have a lot of respect for, they've even had issues where they bought enzymes. Their enzyme product ended up being contaminated with some kind of disinfectant because they bought the enzymes from India because it's cheaper, and when they were cleaning out the machines, they didn't get all the cleaning solvent out, and so they had to recall a whole bunch of stuff. That's happened to good companies. So this whole issue is kind of difficult to know what to do about it. So there's a bit of a leap of faith, and that's one of the criticisms that doctors and researchers have about natural medicines. How do you know if it's safe or not? Another question from Carly, which is a good question. If you're trying to get patients off medication, is there a way to wean them off meds while introducing herbs with the same effects safely, or they should just avoid the herbs altogether? Certain ones, warfarin, I won't even touch. Like Coumadin and stuff like that, I won't even touch that because it's just too difficult. If I'm dealing with, let's say, a nervine, like I'm trying to get somebody off of a drug like Valium or a benzodiazepine, and I want to get them on a herb, then I might slowly cut the, providing their doctor knows what they're doing, I might get them to reduce. It depends if they're taking it as needed or if there's, every single drug is different. So antidepressants, you want to wean them off of it, and I might just wait. If someone's on Prozac or some SSRI, I might wait till they're completely at a very, very low dose before getting them to, actually I just wait till they're completely off it before introducing a herb that might interact with that. I might give them B12 or other things, but it's it's dependent on the individual herb and the drug that they're on, and what are the worst case scenarios. So in some cases, with warfarin, the worst case scenario is they could get a blood clot and die, or they could get hemorrhagic stroke and die. So it's too risky. Worst case scenario, if you're dealing with like getting someone off of Valium and getting them on a Cava, worst case scenario, they'd get a little extra sleepy. They're not going to die. So don't tell them to do it and then go for a car. With antidepressants, they can get something called serotonin syndrome, which could be life-threatening. So if they're on some antidepressant drug and you get them St. John's wort, that could be risky. So anyways, sorry I went over, but there you go. And Carly, I don't think I went any slower for the second half, but at least I got through the lecture. So if you guys have any questions, send me an email. Otherwise, we will see you next week. Same place, same time, I think. Okay, bye for now.